So where I want us to start tonight is, I'm going to take you back to the 70s. So imagine yourself, I was driving down with my husband. I said, I'm going to ask them to imagine themselves in hip hugger, low rider, hip hugger, wide jeans. And he went, you have to check the audience to see if they'll even know what you're talking about. I was like, and I went to the audience, you guys will know what that was, right? So imagine yourself sort of, you've got these sort of ripped jeans and a sort of a ripped t-shirt, and it's an evening in Camden Harbor, and there was some kid sitting on a boat with a guitar playing, and then you start hearing music. So I thought this is a way to start. So I had a book trailer made by David Perez from Camden, because I wanted to give people both a sense of the images and the music. So we're going to start with this.
In 1971, the Oceanic School leased the Sea Cloud, a four-masted, square-rigged yacht built in the 1930s by the businesswoman Marjorie Merriweather Post to be their school at sea.
I chose to go. I sent myself to Oceanics. My parents were like, if you're going to finish high school, then yeah, please go.
She didn't even tell me anything. She just sent me off, and I arrived at the Antarctica and I said, this doesn't look like it's going anywhere right away.
There were 50 mostly American teens, students kicked out of the best boarding schools, Native American brothers, and naive Midwesterners who'd never seen the ocean, who were all sent to a neglected yet once magnificent sailing yacht to learn to sail.
I think when we first got there, the ship was sitting on the bottom. I mean, I think the tide went up and down. I don't think the ship went with it.
I got out of the taxi with my duffel bag and looked at this and I thought, my God, I've come to heaven. On first glimpse, you think, she's a little rough, but with a little elbow grease, we can get it going.
You know what I thought? I thought, what the hell did I get myself into?
The students, teachers, and crew worked for 3 months to restore the ship. They spliced rope, scrubbed the decks, worked in the engine room and in water tanks, and climbed the rigging. When the school finally set sail, the students lashed 16 of the 30 sails to the rigging. But instead of clear sailing, their troubles were just beginning.
There was a payphone, and I would call home once a week, and my mother had no interest in hearing about the ship, but my dad wanted to hear all the details, and I kept thinking he would be shocked and upset about the terrible things that we had to do on the ship, and they didn't seem to be fazed by how dangerous it was.
No one knew that it was impossible. That's the only way it happened.
We were all collected into the ship. The ship wasn't going to float unless we worked it. Let's work it. Let's make it live.
For me, that was a momentous time. We were ready to take on the world. This is normal. This was normal. And that was part of what the late 60s and the 70s were about.
Let you
transition. One moment, everybody.
Okay, great. It's so wonderful to have someone else do the technical, and I'm not in charge. So we are going to start on this hearing about this adventure, but one of the things I want to start with is, before we start, is that two of my publishers are here. Toad Hall Editions is a new publishing company that started during COVID in Northport, Maine, and Amy Tingle and Maya Stein are here, and they have started 2 literary magazines. They've published books. They've made these incredible, beautiful books out of let's just do it, which is sort of the spirit of the ship. It was like it came out of the same kind of spirit. And when you have a manuscript and you're trying to get a book out in the world, it can go on forever. I could still be trying to pitch my book. And it was such an extraordinary moment when they said, we love this story. We want to make it happen. We want this book to happen. It was just, it's like, yes, we're going to do it. And it was incredible to work with them through the whole design process, editing process, and bring it out. And they did such a gorgeous design job as well. Their designer, Liz, isn't here tonight. So anyway, so when I was 18 and my brother was 15, my dad decided to send us off to sea. He had no idea it was a hippie alternative school. He thought it was going to be a sort of a military strict sailing ship to get us to straighten up and get in shape. But it did end up being one of the most educational years of our lives. It was just an extraordinary event. And this is Stephanie Gallagher, who is the director of the school, who none of us knew was only 24 years old and running the school up by the seat of her pants, and probably got us in a lot more trouble. But she was an incredible, charismatic fundraiser and raised enough money that we were able to get the ship fixed so we could take off. So anyway, all right, here's my publisher. Isn't that the coolest frog? Toad. So anyway, in 1971, did you do family picture, Christmas card pictures with the family, and you try to get one picture where everyone looks kind of decent? So this was, this family in a village in Ohio. My middle brother had been paddled 58 times in 8th grade. I was sort of the bookish, nerdy, depressive who wanted to go to college, but my dad at 17 decided I was too young to go to college, and he was going to send me to a secretarial school in New York City. And then my little brother, who was sort of like the good kid. But anyway, my dad was, he was in Cincinnati, and in Cincinnati, there's a Cincinnati Literary Club. And he went there on a particular evening, and this guy said, oh, I know that you're interested in sailing. He had cut this half-page article out of the New York Times in March 1971 and gave it to my dad. And my dad took it to the office. The next day he unfolded it, he read it all out. He called up the director of the school, and he came home that night to dinner to announce that my brother was going to sea, and that he had decided both his problem children were going to sea, and that I also was going to sea. It was like I'd seen the ocean once before in my life. The ocean was this cool thing that we heard about in Ohio, but you didn't really go. I'm back there in the 70s. I hadn't been on an airplane. We had done a big trip all the way to New York City once, and we'd seen the ocean. And it was like, that was a cool thing that you did. And maybe if you were lucky, you did a trip out west, but that was sort of it. And we were pretty landlocked. So saying that I was going off to sea was sort of a shocking, unexpected announcement. And this was the ship. And there's a watercolor version of this in the back that was done by Abe Goodale from Camden, who's this extraordinary watercolor artist, and he did that watercolor for me. This is still the photograph that I have from when I worked for the director of the school the summer before the ship. You can still see I had it taped and I had it thumbtacked. I carried it in my wallet for years because I was so connected to the ship, and I didn't want to let that year go. But this is what the ship looked like when it was owned by Marjorie Merriweather Post, and when she had 70 crew members, beautifully dressed crew members, 70 crew members for enough passengers to fill 7 staterooms. So it was a small group of people being waited on hand and foot, and to have all of them running the lines and the rigging. But so this was the dream of what the ship was going to be like. And then I arrived at the ship, And this is what it was like in the 70s. So I'm going to read to you a little section from the book about when I arrived at the ship the first day. So the taxi from Miami Airport drove slowly through a maze of metal shipping containers stacked 3 high. I clutched my sweaty cash and asked again, making sure I was in the right place. Ashbury Docks, the Antarna, yes? The driver pulled to a stop on an open dock, and through the windshield, I saw a rust-streaked hull and a line of portholes. When I stepped out, the ship towered over me, a huge 4-masted ship I'd only seen in a black and white photograph from the 30s, with its 30 sails filled with the wind and the hull slicing through whitecaps. I still gasped, holy shit, seeing the ship. The ship was swarming with boys. Teenaged, shirtless, long-haired boys lined the railing of the ship and milled around on the dock, and a lot of them seemed to be watching me, a skinny 17-year-old girl in a white linen jacket and short shorts with new sandals and freshly shaved legs. I blushed from all the attention. A couple of tall guys with ripped jeans ambled down the gangway of the ship and walked over towards me. They were tanned, dirt-stained, and grinning. "You're here for oceanics, right?" I could only nod. "Cool," they said, before they hoisted my duffel and backpack from the trunk of the cab and carried them up the gangway and down the deck. I followed them, holding on to the railings until I realized how greasy they were and let go. But at the slight sway of the ship, I grasped on again. I made a mental note: don't wipe the grease on my good clothes. Midway, I paused and looked down at that narrow chasm of dark water between the dock and the hull. This was the ocean. This was the second time I had ever seen it. The rumble of a refrigerator truck compressor brought me back to a cacophony of noise, hammers beating metal, vibrations of engines, and out in the harbor of Miami, cargo ships headed out to sea, sounding their deep horns. Tugs and ships turned wakes. I craned my neck to look up into the Antarna's soaring 4 masts. On deck, a tall guy near me stuck his head into a doorway where a current of hot, oily air poured out and shouted, "Hey, Woody, your sister's here." The guy looked at me and explained, "He's one of the grease monkeys down in the engine room. These guys on the left, these are what the grease monkeys looked like." He gestured toward, and they never got clean. We also didn't have hot water. We didn't have soap. He gestured towards a deck bench where some skinny guys with long hair and filthy blue jumpsuits were smoking. Ah, the grease monkeys. I peered into the doorway where a metal ladder descended into a dark, smelly, deafening realm. I held on to the dirty door handle until I realized how greasy it was and pulled back my hand. Where was I going to wipe my fingers? I stepped back as an oil-streaked teen emerged, his shoulder-length hair held in place by a red handkerchief headband. I didn't recognize him. "Hey," he said in a lackluster voice, "you finally got here." It was Woody. He was so dirty, his skin looked gray. He gestured with his head towards the bow like he was embarrassed to be talking to his sister in front of the others. As we walked forward, I gushed, "The ship is so beautiful. Are we really close to leaving?" He reached the quiet foredeck where a mast as big as the trunk of a mature oak was surrounded by a waterfall of heavy lines on all 4 sides. I looked up past the yardarms and I couldn't even see the top of the mast, but I knew the facts. 4-mast, right, goes 170 feet above the deck. Woody nodded. "I'm going to climb the mainmast someday," he said, "even if it kills me to do it. Once you get to the top, you can hold on to a line, wrap your legs around it, and slide all the way down from the top." Crazy. "Oh, but Woody, you aren't doing anything dangerous, are you?" "What on this ship isn't dangerous?" His face was serious with none of his old sarcasm. "What do you mean?" We sat down on the deck and leaned back against the railing. Rumor has it the last crew on the ship wasn't paid. So when they left, they flooded the engine room with salt water. He grinned. "I can appreciate their act of revenge, but it made a terrible mess for us." He explained that no one had noticed for a few days, and the owners drained the water, had the engine room spray painted so it looked new and clean when Stephanie, the school director, and her husband took the tour. At this moment, there is no working water pumps, no electricity, no engines, no galley, no working heads. Almost nothing works on the ship. He was dead serious. "I know I'm only 15 and all I know about sailing ships comes from reading books about the Napoleonic Wars." He looked at me intently, "But I can tell you, we're in big trouble." But Woody, it can't be that bad. Doesn't anything work? He shrugged his shoulders and a smile slipped across his face. Well, we haven't sunk yet, but that's still possible. But Woody, if it's really dangerous, should we go home? But the moment I imagined home, I clenched inside. This school was our escape. Being home for a week after the summer in New York reminded me, no matter what was happening here, it was safer than home. This ship had to sail. His answer was swift. Hell yeah, it's dangerous, but I won't go home. No way, I'm actually having a great time. And he grinned. So off we went. Let's see. So there's the ship in Miami Harbor, Ashbury Docks, next to the Coast Guard station, if you know the causeway between Miami and Miami Beach. Actually, there was a ship that was stuck right in Miami Harbor and that was turned and blocked. And it was, I looked it up and it was like right next to Ashbury Docks. So what we did back then is there was a payphone on the dock. Most kids called home maybe once a week if their parents were lucky. But I started writing letters and we kept journals. And at the end of the year, I collected all our photographs and made a big photo album that I carried around for 50 years, knowing at some point I was going to write this story. And I finally, 5 or 6 years ago, started. And what was great is I had waited until I was able to have the internet to find friends from the ship. So there were 46 boys, about 5 or 6 girls. There were 10 teachers. I found 12 or 13 of the students. I had kept track of 2 of them. And I found 5 or 6 of the teachers. And then since the book has come out, more people have been finding out about it or sending notes. So eventually we went from total messy, stinky clothes chaos to we had a Danish mate who came on board and got us wearing matching clothes, jeans and shirts, and got us scrubbing the decks with salt water and got us out learning how to row the lifeboats, right? So here we are, barefoot, and we had these big heavy brooms for the deck. The ship had been sitting there in Miami Harbor for 4 years. It had been completely renovated. The man who bought it, I'm going to do just a quick history of the ship because it's so crazy. So it was Marjorie Merriweather Post, and she had it from built in the 30s and out of Germany. And then she sailed in it often around the world. And the Depression was really a kind of a sad and boring time to be in the United States. So she would go off sailing at 6 months at a time. And she had just bought Bird's Eye Foods. So she put in huge freezers so she could take frozen food. It was this new invention. And they would go off sailing. They went sailing in places where no one had ever, where there weren't even charts. And they had people up in the rigging looking down to see what the depth was. They did amazing things. And then they'd come home, and then she would have the social world. And then eventually, when she was on her 3rd husband, he was Ambassador Davies to Russia. He was the ambassador in 1937, 38. So they sailed the ship in all the way up to St. Petersburg, and then they traveled down to Moscow. And then when Stalin's purges got too depressing and difficult, they would go back up and they would have entertain people on their ship, which wasn't, as far as they knew, bugged where the ambassador's house in Moscow was. And also while they were there, they went on spending sprees because they could buy treasures from the czars and that era by the pound. So they filled up the Antarna, or back then it was called the Sea Cloud. They filled it up with all these Russian treasures, which they carried back to the United States and now fill museums in DC. But eventually, then they went to, then there was another husband, I forget, and then World War II started, and then the ship was donated to be of use for the US Navy. And they took down the foremasts, and it was a weather ship in the North Atlantic. And after the ship, the masts were put on, it was renovated, it was in beautiful shape, and it was Marjorie had her ship back. But they discovered that after the war, you just couldn't hire 70 crew members the way you could before and have enough. And it was suddenly a lot more costly. And she decided she wanted an airplane anyway. And that was the way she wanted to travel. And she was getting older and didn't want to do the ship. So she sold the ship to one of her dear friends, Trujillo, who was the dictator of the Dominican Republic. Often very wealthy people hang out with people of questionable politics. So Trujillo's son took the ship around to and had it docked off of Hollywood, and he hung out and put on parties all the time with actresses. And but eventually the ship got back to the Dominican Republic. Trujillo was assassinated. About 6 months after he was assassinated, his body in a lead coffin was snuck aboard, and his family and friends snuck aboard with a lot of gold, and they started sailing for Spain. But there was a revolution in the Dominican Republic. The crew mutinied, and the ship went back to the Dominican Republic. And then they needed to sell it. So the man, sort of as an impulse buy, this man, a minister's son in Tennessee who had some money, but a moderate amount of money, he decided to buy the ship, even though he wasn't used to sailing. He didn't know about sailing, but he bought the ship from the Trujillo or from the Dominican Republic. He had it sent over to Italy. It was in rough shape, so we had put $1 million into it in about 1968, maybe 67. Had it beautifully updated and in gorgeous shape. It came back to the United States. It came through US Customs, and he thought he would just have to pay customs for the work that had been done in Italy. But because it had been bought from a foreign country, the United States Customs wanted duty paid on the whole ship. And he said, I don't have that kind of money. And he just docked the ship. He went home to Tennessee and he just let it sit there. Sort of this strategy will repeat. So we had this woman who made sure the ship was dusted, the staterooms were dusted. He had this skeleton crew who then wasn't paid and filled the engine room with salt water. But then along came 24-year-old Stephanie Gallagher and went, oh, this ship is perfect. We'll have students come aboard. We'll have wealthy donors, and they can be in the staterooms, and we'll sail around the world and have all these people donate money, and we'll put in a lot of money to pay it, get it started. And then we can keep leasing the ship for a few years, and it's going to be fabulous. And then the owners had said, and the ship just needs 2 weeks of work to get ready to sail. But as you heard what my brother said, there wasn't almost anything working, but we got to work. We started scrubbing the decks. The decks were oily. The water tank was completely rusty. The fresh water tank was all rusty. This is Jane and Pogo, who were part of the crew. They had the skinnier, smaller kids who could get into the narrow opening to get down in the fresh water tank with wire brushes, brush down the rust, wash down in pitch dark, wash down the rust, and then then paint it with cement paint, which gets hot as it cures. And kids had to be pulled out every 15 minutes or they would faint, pass out. But they worked for a week. Now I'm going to jump ahead. In 2019, before COVID, fortunately, my husband and I went and sailed on the Sea Cloud, because a lot of my friends had been saying, you need to go to the ship to do research. I was going, I can't afford it. And then I went, all right, I really do need it for research. So the shortest, because the ship, the Sea Cloud, is now a luxury sailing yacht that sails around the world, in the Mediterranean in the summer and the Caribbean in the winter. So Dirk and I talked to different crew members when we were on board. We went on a 4-day cruise around the Canary Islands, which was their shortest cruise. And when we told them about doing this, they did not think this was funny. They're a professional crew, and they thought it was absolutely appalling and extraordinarily dangerous what we were doing. And they said no one goes down in those tanks unless they're wearing this equipment that sends off, bells or buzzers, depending on what kind of noxious or poisonous gases are in the tank. It's just like, it was the beginning of my realizing it's how amazing it was none of us died on the ship. But anyway, one of the things that happens if a ship sits in the tropics for 4 years, the rigging rots. But we didn't know that. And when she leased the ship, she didn't know that until she had a rigger come on board, and the rigger is climbing up in the rigging, and then his foot keeps going through the ratlines. And after he checked, went up and down all 4 masts and did an evaluation, all the running rigging had to be redone. We had to splice and make ratlines between all the lines going up all the way to the top of each of those masts. And then all the running rigging. So Stephanie went back to New York, started fundraising another $100,000. And we got to work learning how to splice. And fortunately, how many of you did macrame in the 70s, 60s and stuff? If you've done a lot of macrame, it turned out I was really good at splicing. I didn't think I was going to be good at anything on the ship. I was good at splicing. And it was like, gave me this whole sense of, I was good at something. So I sat on that deck for a couple of months. It was like all the classes were canceled. The teachers were put to work. They were not particularly happy with that. And all the kids, and we sat out there and we spliced. And then some of the kids who were really good at working in the rigging went up in the rigging, and they started putting the ratlines in place and then running the rigging up and down and replacing all that running rigging and the lines. And that's how, and we had cheat sheets. We had to learn to memorize what line went on which post. And so it was this incredible training program while we were sitting on the deck. So after, unbelievably enough, after 3 months, they also had engineers coming on board and working in the engine room. And they had all these kids down in the engine room. And the girls were sent downstairs to, we had to make the beds for guests in coming into the staterooms. We found that really offensive. But donors started coming on board and things were getting going. And then we finally went, all right, we've got to get out of here. The morale of 50 teenagers going up and down was like way more than the tides. The tides are only 6 inches, but can you imagine the emotional up and down of all these teenagers? But we finally, January 2nd, 1972, we headed out of Miami Harbor. It was the first time they had run the engines and done everything all at the same time. They hadn't even done a test run. And all the kids were off the ship. Because it was flying under the Panamanian flag, so it wasn't an American ship. All the students we were flown over to Grand Bahama Island, where we were sent with a passport or with a approval to be there for 1 day. We had a water bottle and lunch, and then we were to wait there for the ship to show up, not even knowing if the ship was going to be able to motor or limp out of Miami. But amazingly enough, it arrived the next day, and we got out to the ship, and then we started putting up sails, and we limped our way to Veracruz to go into dry dock, and they repaired a hole in the deck. So I'm going to read you one of the adventures. When I made the title of the book, one of the hardest things is figuring out your title. And when I put Sailing at the Edge of Disaster, one of the kids from the ship said, disaster? What was disastrous? I said, read it as an adult. It's unbelievably dangerous what we were doing, besides not having any safety equipment for hooking us onto the rigging. But anyway, the ship had motored over Grand Bahama Island. The kids were on deck. We were getting ready to start motoring the next morning, and I was sleeping on deck, and I jolted awake in the dark when a group of boys ran by yelling, their flashlight beams zipping around me. Were they playing capture the flag in the middle of the night? Then I saw the silhouette of a large man in scuba gear climb over the railing onto the deck. What was happening? When the diver pulled off his mask, it was Carl grumbling to himself. So much for those boys on shark watch for me. They ran off. They were wound up about something. Then he saw me. He reported with excitement, I did it. I got the mattress positioned over the leak. Then he noted my confusion. You don't know what's going on, right? I said, not a clue. He pulled off his tanks and set them on the deck. A couple of hours ago, one of the engine room kids barged into my room. Get your scuba gear. Here, we have a leak in one of the sea chests. He glanced over at me to make sure I understood. Remember when Richie and I scraped the barnacles off the sea chests? When I nodded, Carl explained, last night, an intake valve gave way, meaning there's a hole in the hull with water pouring into the engine room. He fussed with his scuba valve. When I got on deck, 2 students had hauled a single mattress out on deck. I asked, what the hell are you kids doing? One explained, you need to swim down into the sea chest screen with this mattress. We think the suction from the hole in the hull will suck the mattress into the hole and stop the leak. Carl sat down on deck and took off his flippers. It sounded crazy. I stared at him. There's a hole in the hull and you have to cover it with a mattress. This sounds like a joke. Yeah, when I was ready to go in the water, a bunch of kids leaned over the railing with flashlights. I asked, what are you guys doing? Watching for sharks. He grimaced, not exactly comforting. And then I worried the lights would actually attract sharks. Thinking of all that sent a wave of fear through me. Carl peeled off his wetsuit while he talked. Once I was in the water, they tossed the mattress down to me. When I swam near the hull, the mattress was sucked right in up against the sea chest. Amazing, like a giant Band-Aid. Now, eventually I went back to sleep. In the morning, I ran into my friend Pogo. I said, did you hear about the leak in the hull last night? Carl put a mattress over it. Like this was a funny joke. Pogo laughed. Yeah, I know. A boy shook me awake on deck last night saying, we've got a leak. Get one of those sea chest plugs down to the engine room. Boy, did I run. By the time I raced down the ladders into the engine room, water was surging over our feet. So Pogo had been one of the carpenters working in the carpenter's shop, carving these big, they had a big block of wood and they were carving them down to a point because the captain had said, it'd be a really good idea to have these ready just in case we have a water valve blow. And then we did have a water valve blow. Pogo shrugged in his humble way. Because chief engineer Alfonso is a big guy and I'm scrawny, he sent me crawling in where the water was gushing in. I pushed the wooden plug as hard as I could, but the pressure from the leak kept shooting the plug back at me. We were desperate and I was soaked and cold, but suddenly the water slowed to a trickle. That must have been when Carl shoved the mattress against the sea chest. Exactly, but we still had to fasten the plug into place. Finally, Alfonso wailed at it with a sledgehammer and whacked that plug into the hole, which stopped most of the water. Alfonso ordered the bilges to keep pumping full tilt and full time until we got to dry dock 2 weeks later. What a night. Were you scared? I wasn't scared until afterwards. Thank God the plug worked. Then he gave a shy grin. David the carpenter and I celebrated with a bottle of rum at the bow as we watched the sunrise. I'm a bit looped. I'm off to sleep. So that's sort of the kind of way it went on the ship. What ironically, my brother Woodie, after this experience at 15 on the ship, he ended up, after he graduated from high school, going off to Merchant Marine Academy in Baltimore, MEBA, and he became a merchant mariner and eventually worked his way up being a chief engineer. And he said, oh yeah, when there are leaks in the hull, you use a mattress. But when you send a diver down, you make sure the suction pulls in the mattress and not the diver. He said that sometimes has happened. So anyway, we got to dry dock. We got rid of, so the other thing is when you have a ship sitting in a dock in a tropical place for 4 years, how thick do you think the barnacles would be? They were over a foot thick. So that was part of what Carl and some of the kids who had, for scuba class, part of the class was learning how to scrape barnacles off of the essential things until we managed to get to dry dock. It was like sailing with or motoring with a whole reef underneath the ship. And there was all this sea life and living in there and moray eels, and it was quite a lively place. But anyway, we got to Veracruz, we came out of dry dock, we started getting so we started getting the sails up. We finally got 16 of the sails up, and the captain gave us some rest and we were sleeping on deck, and it was just like being lulled. It was just absolute heaven. And we were on our way to Panama. We were going to go through the canal because our ship was sailing under the Panamanian flag. One of the Panamanian officials from the embassy in Miami had promised us that we would have free passage through the canal. So here we're on our way. We're going to go to the Galapagos in 1972. Can you imagine the opportunity for science class? And it was like, we're going to get back to school. We're going to learn so much. This is so cool. And we sailed into Panama Harbor. And the owner of the ship and his ship management guy had arrived. They had bribed officials, and we arrived and were told that there was going to be a drug search the next day. And then we were put under armed guard and we were held hostage in Panama until they starved us off the ship. That's what a lot of the story is about in the book. And this is kids on the ship. This is our last time leaving the ship in Panama. We had completely re-rigged her, makes me cry. We had made her an extraordinary ship and we loved that ship. And then we had to leave her. And the owner, we don't know if he even went on board. He discovered that in 1972, no one had the money to rent a ship for $8,000 a day, let alone come up with crew. And they just left it there. And the rigging rotted, the sails rotted, the Welsh sails rotted, the barnacles came back, the teak decks pulled up, the engines just started rotted, and people sailing through Panama, it was often a bay off to the side, they would see it and we would hear reports of, oh yeah, I saw your ship. And it was just this amazing negligence of just letting it just sit there. And then fortunately, this group of Germans had a small company and they decided to save the ship. And they put together a crew that, unbelievably enough, they got the ship patched together enough that they motored it across the Atlantic back to Germany. It took a couple of years. It took double what they thought it would cost, but it's been sailing as a luxury, extraordinary sailing yacht ever since. So the book is full of adventures of that year. And I did an interview with Michelle Rito, who does interviews writers of memoirs, and we had a lively hour-long conversation. So there are cards back there if you want to check out an interview about the ship. So anyway, if you have any questions for me, ask away. Yes.
So what happened once you were off the ship?
So that's a good question. Stephanie, our ever enthusiastic, dynamic school director, said, who wants to keep continuing being a school? So we had a vote and people wrote notes and we were, teenage anguish, and we went, we have to keep being a school. We're going to do it. And she went, I'm going to come up with another ship. And some parents donated a farm in Puerto Rico. Some parents got together and donated and leased an airplane that got us out of Panama. And some of the kids took off and some of the kids went to this farm in Puerto Rico where they sat for about 6 weeks. And she came up with a small square rig sailing ship that turned out actually to be a schooner that had square sail rigging added to it for the movie High Wind off of Jamaica. So it was completely unsailworthy and top heavy. And the first day out, so she had sent this group of students and a few crew members. They went to the ship. It had just been sitting as a museum in a backwater in Florida. They did all this stuff to get it ready. Then they were getting ready to take on students from Puerto Rico. They went out and started sailing down the coast, and the ship ended up maydaying and almost sinking and being rescued by the Coast Guard. I arrived 2 days later to be a teacher and help with cooking. And Steffi had forgotten to mention to me that the ship had almost sunk 2 days earlier, and all these other kids arrived. And we patched holes in the ship and did all these things and tried it again and realized it was top heavy. And maybe we should really concentrate on schoolwork. So we sort of went on only on really flat water days. We sort of hopscotched down the coast and we found a cheap place to moor the ship. And then people just started leaving. So that was the end. So the next year, the school leased the Statsraad Lemkuhl, which is a Norwegian sail training, very professional. They leased it with Norwegian crew. The students, they had, I think, 100 students that year. They sailed for 10 months. They sailed 10,000 miles, and they did the trip that they left Bergen, Norway. They did their sail training up in one of the fjords. They left, they sailed down to the coast of Africa. They went across to South America. They went through the Panama Canal. They went up the coast of the United States and back to Norway. One of the women on the ship, Jane, came back as a sailor that year and was paid crew. And I asked her, what do you think of each year? She said they were both remarkable years. She couldn't say which one she liked more than the other, because our year was crazy and their year was really hardworking and amazing. And then the school lasted until 1979. Every year had a few years later, they leased a ship that had been Goebbels' personal yacht, and it was so rusted through, the captain refused to sail on it, so they had other people who sailed it. And that was the year some of the students got arrested in Colombia for drugs, and so it was a hippie school, right? So the Oceanic School. Yes.
Did your father think your year was money well spent?
I was working for room and board. And and my brother was half tuition, and my dad thought it was absolutely great. And that it had really gotten us worked into shape. Yeah.
Why did your brother get there before you did?
I had been working in New York, and I got home and I got sick. So he went ahead of, and he was sent down early. He was one of the first students on board. So yeah, there's more details of that. And he was almost sent home for a bad attitude. His bad attitude was he was saying what was true about the ship. But he said in that video at the beginning, he was one of those lively voices. When I was working with David Perez to make that book trailer, he said, round up some of the liveliest storytellers from the people on the ship, and then we'll have this roundtable conversation. He'll record it, and then he'll put cuts together for the film. So my brother was in New Hampshire. Pogo is an architect in China. One of the teachers, Mike, who taught mythology and folklore and dreams, we kept dream journals. He was in California. Kim, who is the hardworking wild girl, she was in England. So if you're trying to do a Zoom call for all those countries, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time was the perfect time. And we had such a great time talking. We just didn't want to stop. We had, because it was like it transported us back there. And what was extraordinary for me as a writer is that when I was 17 and 18 on that ship, I was still struggling with depression. I was just struggling coming out of a really dysfunctional, traumatic childhood. And I was writing in my journal, sometimes 10 pages a day. That was where I became a writer. I really wrote endlessly on that. But there was so much that I didn't know what was going on, and it was kind of clueless. So in a way, writing this book, I got to re-experience our year at sea. And I got to round up all these friends of mine. And there were times where we would get I created a private Facebook page for teachers and students on the ship. And people kept sending in pictures, and I would put out a question like, it says here in this book, I have back there's a book about the sea cloud. It says here in the book with an interview with the captain that we were shot at in Panama. That didn't happen, did it? And all these kids said, oh no, that didn't happen. I didn't hear any of that. And then my two closest friends said, oh yeah, that happened. And then this other friend said, yeah, we were there, that our ship was at a mooring, and there was a big cargo ship next to it. And with the way the tide was turning, the ship was just going to run into us. And we had two PT boats, one at our bow, one on to the side, that were watching us with machine guns uncovered on deck. And so the captain thought, all right, right at dawn or before, when it's still dark, we're going to raise the anchor chain just a little to see if we can get our boat to drift a bit so we don't get run into by this cargo ship. Well, our anchor chains are never quiet, and especially anchor chains this big. And when the anchor is gigantic. So they started, so Zip, who's now, he installs solar technology down in Costa Rica. He was there on the foredeck getting the engine going to lift the anchor chain. And there started being shouts on the PT boat that was right down there, and they shot right over his head. He felt the wind go through his hair. Meanwhile, Pogo was out in the bowsprit net, below the bowsprit, because I had told him it's the coolest place to be on the ship. You have to do it before you leave the ship. So he was out there with these bullets going overhead, and he was assuming that that was the last moment of his life. And my friend Kim was up on the bridge with the captain, and she saw it all. And then they immediately stopped the anchor chain. We didn't get hit by the cargo ship, but they had never told anyone that story, which was probably a good idea, not to tell a ship full of teenagers with explosive emotional that we had just been shot at. But that was the day the captain said, we've got to get the kids off of here. Yeah.
Did you ever get seasick?
I actually, not until we were in 20-foot swells. But for the most part, I did really well with seasickness. Yeah, there were some kids, Pogo was so sick. He had grown up sailing, but on this ship, he got so seasick. We would rope him to one of the chair or the deck benches. So he would be out there all night in the storm, in the high waves, because he was just so sick.
Oh my God. But that made me feel better.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you still sail?
Not really. I learned how to steer a 360-foot yacht, and I've gone out sailing with a few other friends, but I never had a chance to really get into it beyond that. Yes.
So did you ever go to college?
Yeah.
And
I studied mythology and folklore. I was inspired by mythology and folklore class, and I studied classics. I studied Homer at Harvard, and I ended up graduating from Johns Hopkins. And then I went off to become a carpenter, and was a carpenter in Berkeley for several years. And then I decided to become an acupuncturist, so I went to acupuncture school. And then I eventually came to Maine in 1985. Yeah, so a good 1970s sort of curriculum of life. All right, well, thank you all for coming.